Hey guys, Lex here with an updated Greatsword of Solitude build video. I know a lot of you here have probably seen my first one, and I just wanted to give you the version of the build that I've been running with the most success at the end of the DLC. But I received a lot of messages from you guys saying that you ran the previous version to the end of the DLC, which I think is awesome. I'm super happy to hear that. I'm glad it worked out for you so well. Yeah, that's awesome. So obviously the first version is still viable, but the build has gone through some changes as I've been experimenting and min-maxing towards the end of the DLC. For starters, I'm rune level 150 now, which is obviously a big change from the first video. I'm rune level 125. Just at 150, the PvP is still active and I wanted the extra stat points, but I've also updated my offhand and talisman choices based on a lot of the boss encounters I was running into towards the latter half of the DLC. But right now I can confidently say that this is the perfect version of the value knight build. I call it that because despite being a strength melee main, you can take advantage of so much that this game has to offer with this build, aside from straight sorcery and incantation casting. And this is not even from a jack of all trades, master of none perspective. You can do so many different things with this build, and effectively. Let's jump in. Alright, so obviously as the title implies, I am still using the Greatsword of Solitude. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail over its strengths and weaknesses, as I covered them in my previous video, but again, what you should know is that it has super good strength scaling, so it hits like a truck with the more strength that you have, and it has a guard boost and physical damage reduction of a competent medium shield when blocking in both hands. And you should pretty much be holding this thing with two hands anytime you're attacking. What I will say is I've been doing more and more guard countering, and this is actually the method that let me beat the last boss in less than 2 hours during my blind playthrough. I touch upon this in the first video, but it's a bit wild to me that with the combination of the deflecting hard tier and the stone barb crack tier as your Flask of Physick, you can stagger many bosses in just two guard counters, guys. Assuming you are solo, though I think Radon might take 2 and some change. Regardless, this is massive, and it let me beat a few bosses earlier in the DLC very quickly. Commander Gaius in 3 tries, Meteor Mother of Fingers and Romina on the first try, etc. I really think that the deflecting hard tier with this weapon serves as the foundation for this build, as far as boss fights go, and I cannot stress enough how strong this is. For PvP, I swap out the Stone Barb Crack tier for the Crimson Bubble tier because stance breaking isn't really a thing in PvP, and that heal you get near death with the Bubble tier will save you in a lot of situations. However, I still run the deflecting hard tier, guys, and if you haven't tried it in PvP yet, I highly recommend it. It's great at interrupting light attack spammers, dealing big damage, and a lot of players aren't expecting it. Yeah, it's super strong. Just hope that your connection with the host is decent. The Ash of War is something I broke down in my first video, so I'll sum it up real quick. Yeah, it's strong. The first half has a projectile and melee swing component to it, so hitting a target with both at once will deal the most damage, but the damage of the projectile itself is still respectable. Hitting the strong attack button towards the end of this animation will perform the second part of the Ash of War, which consists of a dash and a sweeping horizontal swipe. The second half of this Ash of War does a lot of damage, and much more poise damage than the first. And that short dash you perform before the swing can stun enemies into the slash, provided they aren't hit too early in the dash animation, because they can just roll out of it if they are. Something that I think is worth mentioning here is that there is a true combo with this Ash of War in PvP, as a lot of other content creators have already pointed out. If you hit someone in melee range with the first part of this Ash of War, you can simply light attack right after, and it will hit them every time. And it's better to do this combo in a lot of situations since the second half of the Ash of War is more easily avoidable. So I've been using this for the assured combo damage you can get out of it. Also, and this may not be news to you if you've been following my channel since I made a whole video comparing these, I've updated my crossbow offhand choice to the Pulley crossbow, at least for progressing through the DLC. The Pulley is just so much more practical at landing shots at a range and applying status effects compared to the spread crossbow, which unfortunately eats up too many bolts for its status effects and honestly is often used at a range when I'd rather just be swinging the greatsword. You have to be very close for maximum value out of the spread crossbow. However, that being said, for you PvPers out there, the spread crossbow is actually still much more effective than the Pulley for duels and invasions. So much so that the current version of the build still allows me to equip it. It really is that good, and you can often bleed or freeze players from mid-range in 2 to 3 shots. You don't even have to be point blank. It's a super strong option against players, so for that alone I keep it as part of my arsenal. But you know, if you're not a PvPer or an invader, I recommend switching to the Pulley, and I think you'll see a lot more success. Also, I realized I did not go over my bolt choices for the offhand crossbow, and to no surprise, I tend to run the Burred bolts alongside the craftable Coldbone bolts. Burred bolts inflict a lot of bleeding and are unlimited to purchase from the Imprisoned Merchant and the Dynasty Mausoleum. Though again, you should just murder this guy and take his bell bearing for setting up shop in, one of the most dangerous places in the lands between. As far as the Coldbone bolts go, you can buy unlimited amounts of thin beast bones from the Twin Maiden Husks after you turn in the Bone Peddler's bell bearing. You get that from killing the bell bearing hunter in Limgrave at the War Master's shack at night. Unfortunately, you cannot straight up buy unlimited amounts of round crystal buds, which you need for these bolts. And I absolutely detest farming in a game like this. However, farming these I'll make an exception for because it's actually not that bad. In the Consecrated Snowfield, if you just spawn at the Ordina Liturgical Town site of Grace and run west, you'll find a ton around these frozen trees, and honestly it's not hard to cap out on these bolts after making this run several times, so it's not terrible. Anyways, in boss fights where the crossbow is usable, I'll often go for a bleed first thing, just to get a head start in damage. Then try to get Frostbite applied before the boss gets aggressive, and I commit to melee, since the boss has a hefty 20% absorption debuff when frostbitten, allowing your already hard-hitting melee attacks to hit even harder. From there it depends on the fight, but I'll often try to get a couple more bleed procs if the boss allows it. You know, if they like to leap away at a range or channel some ability you don't want to be close for. Alright, Talisman Updates. My go-to set for PvE is the Shard of Alexander, the Greatjar's Arsenal, Erdtree's Favor +2, and yes, I found the two-handed sword talisman since last time, and this fits in nicely for a flat 15% damage boost while two-handing, which you should be doing with the sword most of the time. And yeah, that's a pretty big boost in damage. This talisman is pretty heavy though, so I consider it a flex spot, and I tend to switch it out with other things like the Crimson Dagger talisman if I'm progressing through a new area and need some heals, which you will undoubtedly be getting from the amount of stance breaking you'll be doing, and also to get rid of some of that chip damage if you're blocking a lot. However, I've been running the curved sword talisman instead of the Shard of Alexander for certain boss fights. Sometimes bosses are so aggressive that the Ash of War is a bit more difficult to pull off, and I find myself getting way more value out of hitting harder with the guard counters. Honestly, this particular talisman setup with the curved sword talisman and the two-handed sword talisman on at once is a super strong setup for bosses like Gaius or Mesmer, and honestly this is what I use to beat Radahn. They're just so aggressive and are often in your face, so having both the two-handed sword talisman and the curved sword talisman result in big chonky damage from those guard counters. For PvP, the two-handed sword talisman's damage is severely nerfed. I think it's only around 7 or 8% that you're getting out of the thing, so in my opinion it's not really worth it. I think you want to switch it out for something like the Bull Goat's Talisman for a bunch of extra poise, or something like the Crimson Amber Medallion for a big chunk of extra health. Since the Solitude armor already has a bunch of poise, it pretty much depends on your preferences. Some of the more significant equipment updates include the Buckler and the Bone Bow. Having the option to parry alongside the already present strengths of this build makes it even better, because as much as I'd love to guard counter every combo, there are some combos that are parryable but not guard counterable. I think a good example of this is on Vidra. He has a combo that even when you perfect block every hit, he'll knock you back very far on the last swing and you'll be out of range for the guard counter. And if you try guard countering before the combo is over, you'll just get interrupted and hit. However, you can just simply parry the first swing of this combo instead and potentially go for 2 more to get that free critical hit. The Bone Bow and its Ash of War are honestly quite impressive and a bit of a menace in PvP right now. It's a pretty light bow weighing in at 3, and its Ash of War lets you shoot homing arrows. This allows you to take advantage of another ammo type to further apply status effects like bleed or sleep or frostbite at a range, and is honestly a pretty strong harassment tool in invasions. Other than that though, we're boasting a hefty amount of endurance with this new build, so you're also able to equip all sorts of range support without going into heavy rolling, you know, like Igon's Great Bow, Rabath's Cannon. You can also equip both crossbow types if you really wanted without going into heavy rolling, etc. Alright, so the stats that allow me to equip and use all this stuff. Honestly, after experimenting around with a few different stat allocations at rune level 150, I've decided that the 54 strength cap is actually good enough for this build, since when two-handing a weapon you essentially have around 80 strength. That's just how strength works when two-handing, it's multiplied by 1.5. And initially I was experimenting with around 72 strength, but honestly this was only netting me around 40-ish attack rating more for 18 stat points, which felt a bit inefficient, so I opted to hit the two-hander soft cap to free up other options. This means we can dump a significant amount of stat points elsewhere, and I decided to bump up my endurance alongside my faith and mind a good bit from last video. Hitting the 50 endurance cap feels really good since we're already wearing some really heavy stuff, and we're now getting the extra weight load and the biggest stamina bar possible, which helps for those times that you flub a perfect block or two. This is obviously what allows me to switch out all sorts of equipment. We mentioned the great bows and cannons that we can equip because of this extra weight load, which feels really great, especially for invasions. On top of that, we have 15 faith, so we no longer have to hard swap to the 2 fingers heirloom to cast Flame Cleanse Me or Bestial Vitality, and I've also added Flame Grant Me Strength, which is a significant damage boost in PvE and PvP, though it is kind of tough to pull it off in the middle of a DLC boss fight, so it's probably best used right before you enter the Fog Gate for some extra damage in phase 1. You could also just hit 10 faith and hard swap to the 2 fingers heirloom if you don't mind doing that for Flame Grant Me Strength, to free up those 5 points for either some strength or mind, but you know, I might just be lazy. However, I think we can discuss some alternatives here. For instance, if you don't want to run a crossbow offhand, don't care about access to different ranged options, and you just want to hit as hard as possible with the Greatsword of Solitude, you can pull the points from endurance and dexterity as long as you hit the 13 minimum for the sword, and faith to try and hit the 80 strength hard cap. I would still recommend sticking around 40 endurance at a minimum though. You'll want the extra stamina though. Theoretically, you can get by with 37 endurance if you're only planning to use the Greatsword, and this is with the heaviest talisman choices. But again, the damage scaling is not super efficient with strength after 54 if you're two-handing, so I would recommend putting some points elsewhere. Anyways, it's pretty much the build I've been running since respeccing at rune level 150. I gotta say that this is my favorite Elden Ring build that I've come up with, and I realize it's probably pretty close to a lot of like min-max strength builds out there, but you know, what can I say? I love the idea of being like a super strong, hard-hitting melee user, but also being a menace at a range. You're tanky, you have medium roll, you have a block, you have a parry, you have range damage, you have status effects. Again, aside from straight up casting magic, this build takes advantage of so many of the game mechanics present in Elden Ring, and it feels really good. It feels like you're making use of a lot of what the game has to offer. But yeah, that's the build that took me to the end of the DLC. Let me know what you guys think of this build and what you think I should do next. Well, actually, I've been having a lot of fun with this storm build that I've concocted, so that may actually be next, but please let me know what you guys want to see. I'm always open to suggestions, but for now, that's going to be it. Till next time.